All right, let me start with something so ordinary that you almost don't notice it happening. Right now, wherever you are. You're probably sitting still. You feel the chair under you. Your feet might be touching the floor. Maybe there's a faint hum of a room, or the quiet pressure of your own body resting against gravity. Nothing dramatic is happening. No rushing wind, no sense of motion, no vibration that suggests anything extraordinary. And yet you are moving. Not metaphorically, not philosophically, physically, violently. In a certain sense, as you sit there perfectly still, you are spinning around the axis of the Earth at roughly 1,600 kilometers per hour, if you happen to be near the equator, even if you're farther north or south. You're still rotating at hundreds of kilometers per hour, and at the same time, the entire planet you're attached to is orbiting the sun at about 30 kilometers per second. That's not per hour per second. And the sun itself is moving through the galaxy. And the galaxy itself is moving relative to other galaxies. So right now, while you feel absolutely motionless, you are participating in a stack of motions so enormous, so fast, and so layered that if you tried to imagine them literally, really imagine them, it would feel like you should be thrown violently backward into space. But you don't feel anything. And that's not a small puzzle. It's not a cute trick of perception. It's a very deep crack in what you think, feeling, and reality mean. Because you see, your experience tells you something very clear. Motion should feel like motion. If a bus starts moving, you feel it. If an elevator drops, you feel it. If a car turns sharply, your body knows immediately. Your entire nervous system is built on the idea that motion and sensation go together. And yet the largest motions you are part of, the truly gigantic ones, are completely absent from your experience. So already we have a problem. Your senses are not reporting reality in any simple way. They're reporting something else, something filtered, something relative, something conditional. And physics? Well, physics doesn't really fix this problem. It actually makes it stranger. Because the deeper we look, the less sense it makes to even ask what it would mean to feel motion in any absolute way. Let me try to show you what I mean. Imagine you're inside a perfectly sealed room. No windows. No vibrations from outside. The air is still. The lighting is steady. You can walk around. Sit down. Toss a ball in the air, everything behaves exactly normally. Now suppose that entire room is floating in empty space, far away from any stars or planets. And suppose it is moving at a constant speed, let's say 10. 0, 0, 0 kilometers per hour in some direction. Can you tell? You can perform any experiment you like inside that room, and you will find absolutely no evidence that you are moving at all. The ball you toss will rise and fall normally. Your footsteps will feel normal. The air will feel still. This isn't a limitation of your senses. It's not because you're not clever enough. It's not because you lack better instruments. It's because, in a very deep sense, there is no fact of the matter about whether you are moving in any absolute way. Motion, it turns out, is not something that exists by itself. It only exists relative to something else. Now that sounds simple at first. You've probably heard that before, but I want you to slow down and really feel what it means. If motion is always relative, then when you say, "I am sitting still," what you really mean is you are not changing your position relative to the floor beneath you, the walls around you, and the local gravitational environment. But relative to the sun, you are not still. Relative to the center of the galaxy, you are certainly not still. Relative to the cosmic microwave background, the leftover radiation from the early universe, you are moving in a very precise, measurable way. So which one is the real motion? There isn't one. And this is where intuition starts to break. Because your mind desperately wants there to be a final answer, a true, absolute state of motion, a cosmic reference frame that says, this is what it means to be truly at rest. But as far as we can tell, there isn't any. The universe does not come with a built-in grid that says, here is the true stillness, here is the true movement. Instead, everything is defined in relation to something else. And this leads to a very uncomfortable realization. The reason you can't feel the earth moving is not just because it's moving smoothly, or because you're used to it, or because your senses are limited. It's because the very idea of feeling motion only makes sense when there is a change relative to your immediate surroundings. Your body is not designed to detect motion itself. It's designed to detect changes in motion, acceleration, rotation, differences, not motion. Motion by itself, constant. Unchanging motion is completely invisible to you, not because you're flawed, but because, in a certain sense, it isn't something that can be experienced at all. And now we're in strange territory, because that means the most enormous, powerful, and continuous movements you are part of are fundamentally absent from your lived reality. You are carried along by them perfectly, seamlessly, without any signal. So what does that say about experience? It says something very disturbing. It says that what feels like a complete picture of reality, what feels like a full report of what is happening, is actually a very narrow slice, tuned not for truth, but for survival. Your senses do not tell you how the world really is. They tell you what differences matter for staying alive. You feel acceleration because it might throw you off balance. You feel pressure because it might harm your body. You feel changes in motion because they affect your ability to act. But the deeper structure of reality, the enormous background motions, the silent frameworks in which everything unfolds, those are completely hidden from you. And physics doesn't restore them to you in any satisfying way. It only tells you, in mathematical language, that they exist. But knowing they exist is not the same as experiencing them. And that gap between what you know is happening and what you can possibly feel never closes. Let me try another angle. Think about standing on a train platform. A train pulls up next to you. And for a moment, you can't tell whether it is moving or whether your train is moving. The two frames of reference slide past each other. And there's a strange ambiguity, a little flicker in your perception. For a brief instant, you genuinely don't know which one is really in motion. That little moment of confusion is not a failure of perception. It's a glimpse into how the universe actually works. Because there is no deeper answer waiting behind it. If both trains are moving at constant speed relative to each other, physics does not assign a special status to either one. There is no hidden label that says this one is truly moving. This one is truly still. The ambiguity is real. And that's unsettling, because it means reality itself does not have the solid, anchored structure you instinctively assume. It's more like a web of relationships, endlessly defined by comparisons, never grounded in an absolute point. And now here's where it becomes psychologically disturbing, because you don't experience reality as a web of relationships. You experience it as a stable world, with you at the center, sitting still, observing things that move around you. Your perception is egocentric, not in the sense of arrogance, but in the literal sense that everything is structured around your own frame. You feel like the reference point, But physics quietly tells you you are not a reference point in any absolute way. You are just one moving piece among many, with no privileged status. And there is no way, none at all, for you to step outside all frames of reference and see the real motion from nowhere. That position does not exist. And if you think about that long enough, it starts to dissolve something very deep in the way you assume reality works. Because you realize that your sense of stillness, that quiet, grounded feeling of being here, is not an absolute fact about the world. It's a local illusion produced by shared motion with everything around you. You and the chair, and the building, and the ground beneath it, and the air around you. You are all moving together. So you cancel out each other's motion. And what remains is a sense of stillness. But it's not stillness in any universal sense. It's just the absence of relative change. And that's a very different thing. It means that what feels like a solid, unmoving foundation is actually a perfectly synchronized drift through space. You are not resting on something that is fundamentally still. You are riding along with something that is fundamentally moving, and you only feel stable because you are carried perfectly with it. So when you ask, why can't I feel the earth moving? The deeper answer is not just about speed or smoothness. It's about the structure of reality itself. There is no such thing as feeling motion in any absolute sense. There is only feeling differences. And where there are no differences, where everything moves together, there is silence. And that silence is not a gap in your senses. It's built into the way the universe works. Now, if we follow this further, it leads somewhere even more unsettling. Because once you accept that your experience is fundamentally relational, dependent on differences rather than absolutes, you start to see that this applies to more than motion. It applies to almost everything you perceive. You don't see light itself. You see changes in light. You don't hear sound itself. You hear variations in air pressure. You don't feel temperature itself. You feel heat flowing in or out of your body. In other words, your entire sensory world is built on detecting contrasts, gradients, and changes, not absolute states. So there may be vast, stable aspects of reality, enormous, constant backgrounds that you will never directly experience because they never produce differences relative to you. And physics suggests that such backgrounds do exist. Space itself might have properties you cannot feel. Time itself might flow in ways you cannot detect. There might be layers of motion and structure that remain permanently invisible because you are carried along with them perfectly. So your experience of reality, which feels complete and self-contained, is actually more like a thin film floating on top of something much larger and much stranger. And the unsettling part is not just that you don't know what lies beneath. It's that there may be no way to know, no way even in principle, because knowledge itself depends on detecting differences. And if something never produces a difference relative to you, it remains beyond all possible observation. So now we come back to the original discomfort. You sit there, feeling still, but you are not still. You never have been. And there is no point in the universe from which your true motion could be revealed as a single, final fact. There is only an endless network of relationships, each frame defining motion differently, none of them privileged. And this means that your intuitive sense of reality, the idea that there is a fixed, settled world with clear, absolute properties, is not supported by how things actually work. Reality is not settled in that way. It is always defined relative to something else, always incomplete, from any single perspective, always missing a final anchor. And if you stay with that idea long enough, you start to feel a peculiar shift. Not confusion exactly, not fear, but a kind of quiet instability, because you realize that your experience of being here, now, at rest, is not a fundamental truth about the world. It's a local condition, contingent on a particular arrangement of motion. You are not standing on a fixed stage. You are embedded in a moving system with no ultimate reference point, and there is no way to step outside that system to see it from nowhere. So when you ask why you cannot feel the earth moving, the deepest answer is not about your senses failing. It's that the question itself assumes something that does not exist, an absolute state of motion that could, in principle, be felt, but there is no such thing. There is only motion relative to other things. And once everything around you shares the same motion, the universe falls silent. Not because nothing is happening, but because everything is happening together. And that silence, that perfect cancellation of differences, is what you call stillness. So you sit there, feeling completely at rest, while in reality, you are being carried through space at unimaginable speeds, inside layers of motion that never announce themselves. And the strangest part is this: even if you understand all of this, even if you know the numbers, the physics, the logic, you still cannot feel it. The knowledge never becomes experience. The gap never closes. You remain inside a world that feels stable, settled, and unmoving, while knowing that it is none of those things in any absolute sense. And that is where the real discomfort lives. Because it means reality is not something you ever fully inhabit as it truly is. You inhabit only a thin, relational version of it, one defined by what changes relative to you, not by what is. And there is no way to step beyond that condition. No way to finally stand outside all motion and see the universe from a true point of rest. Such a point does not exist. So the question never resolves. It only widens. And you are left here, sitting quietly, feeling perfectly still, while everything, including you, continues to move. And if you stay with that long enough, really stay with it, not just nod and move on, something else begins to crack. Something deeper than the simple idea of motion. Because you start to notice that what we've been talking about is not just a physical limitation. It's a structural limitation of experience itself. You see, it's not merely that you can't feel the earth moving because your senses aren't sensitive enough. It's that there is no possible sensory system that could ever feel it, not yours, not a more advanced creature's, not an infinitely refined instrument, as long as that system moves along perfectly with what it is trying to detect. This is not a technological barrier. It's a logical one. Let me try to show you this from another angle. Imagine you're inside an elevator that is falling freely in space, far away from any air resistance. You and the elevator are accelerating together under gravity. Inside that elevator, if you release an object, it floats beside you. You feel weightless. You cannot tell from any local experiment that you are being accelerated by gravity. As far as your experience goes, you might as well be drifting in deep space, far from any gravitational field at all. And here's the strange part. Physics tells us that locally there is no difference between those two situations. There is no hidden signal you are missing. There is no deeper measurement that would suddenly reveal the truth from inside. The equivalence is exact. So you see, this problem is not just about motion. It's about the impossibility of stepping outside your own frame of reference. You are trapped inside it. Not in a dramatic way, not like a prison cell, but in a quiet, absolute way. Everything you experience, every measurement you make, every thought you form, happens within a frame that you cannot escape. You can compare frames. You can transform between them mathematically. You can build elaborate theories about how they relate, but you can never occupy a position outside all frames at once. There is no God's eye view available to you, not even in principle. And this has a very unsettling consequence. It means that reality, as you know it, is always partial, always conditional, always tied to a perspective that cannot be removed. You never encounter the universe as it is in itself. You encounter it only as it appears relative to where you are embedded within it. Now, at first, this might sound like philosophy, but it's not. It's physics, and very concrete physics at that. Because when we try to build theories of motion, of space, of time, we are forced to accept that all measurements depend on who is measuring, where they are, and how they are moving. There is no measurement that stands outside all observers. No absolute clock that ticks for the entire universe. No absolute ruler that measures distances independently of perspective. Even time itself, something you feel as steady, flowing. Universal is not the same for different observers in motion relative to each other. Two people moving differently through space literally experience different amounts of time between the same events. And not just in theory. We have measured this. Clocks on airplanes run at different rates than clocks on the ground. Particles moving near the speed of light live longer than identical particles at rest. So the very idea that there is one single shared now for the whole universe collapses. There is no universal present moment. There are only local present moments tied to specific observers in specific states of motion. Now, pause there, because this is where the discomfort deepens. Your experience tells you something very different. It tells you that time is flowing uniformly everywhere. That right now, this very instant, is the same instant for everyone. That there is a single now sweeping across the universe like a wave. But physics quietly says, that's not how it works. The now you feel is not a universal feature of reality. It's a local feature of your perspective. Another observer, moving differently, slices time in a different way. There now cuts through the universe along a different plane. And there is no master clock that reconciles these perspectives into a single, absolute timeline. So just as you cannot feel the earth moving because you share its motion, you also cannot feel time's relativity because you share a local temporal frame with everything around you. Your experience smooths out these differences. It hides them. It presents a stable world with a single flow of time and a solid sense of rest. But that stability is not fundamental. It is constructed. It emerges from the fact that you, your environment, and the systems you interact with are all moving together, aging together, evolving together. You cancel out the differences, and what remains feels like an absolute, but it isn't. Now here's where the psychological target begins to shift, because you might start to notice something unsettling. If motion is relative, if time is relative, if simultaneity is relative, then what exactly do you mean when you say something is happening in any final, objective sense? That question is not easy to answer, because every statement about what is happening depends on a frame, a set of conditions. a perspective, a way of slicing reality. There is no description that stands completely outside all possible frames. And this means something very strange about understanding itself. Understanding feels like it should bring you closer to a final, settled picture of reality, a picture where everything is pinned down, where the uncertainty is removed. But the deeper physics goes, the more it shows that there is no final frame in which everything becomes fully settled. There is always another transformation, another perspective, another way of describing the same events. And none of them is the ultimate one. So knowledge does not converge toward a single, fixed view. It expands into a network of equivalent views, each incomplete on its own. And that can feel deeply unsatisfying, because your intuition wants a final ground, a place where all relative descriptions collapse into one absolute truth. But physics doesn't give you that. It gives you a structure where relativity is not a temporary limitation, but a permanent feature. And now we can return, once again, to that simple starting point, sitting still. You feel anchored. You feel like you are at rest in a stable world. But that feeling depends entirely on the fact that everything you interact with shares your motion. The moment that shared motion breaks, when a car accelerates, when a train jerks forward, when gravity shifts, you suddenly feel movement. But notice something important. What you feel is not motion itself. You feel a change in motion, acceleration, difference. Your body has no direct access to constant velocity. It only responds when that velocity changes. So, from your deepest sensory level upward, your experience is structured around detecting discontinuities, not absolute states. And this suggests something profoundly unsettling. It suggests that if the entire universe, every single part of it, were to change in exactly the same way, at exactly the same time, you would never know. If every atom, every field, every clock, every process sped up or slowed down uniformly, there would be no internal signal to reveal it. No experiment could detect it, because all experiments rely on comparing one process to another. And if all processes change together, the comparisons remain the same. So the universe could, in principle, undergo enormous global changes, changes that are perfectly synchronized and from within. They would be completely invisible. Now, that's not just a technical point. It's a profound limitation on what knowing reality could ever mean, because it tells you that there are aspects of the universe that are fundamentally beyond detection, not because they are hidden behind complexity, but because they produce no relative differences. And if something produces no relative differences, it cannot be observed. It cannot be experienced. It cannot even be meaningfully described in operational terms. So your knowledge of reality is not just incomplete in a practical sense. It is incomplete in principle. There are entire categories of possible facts about the universe that you can never access, because access itself requires contrast. And where there is perfect uniformity, there is silence. Now notice how this returns us to that original discomfort in a deeper way. You cannot feel the earth moving, not because you are missing some subtle sensation, but because the structure of reality and the structure of experience makes it impossible. You are embedded in a system of shared motion that cancels itself out from within. You are carried along so perfectly that no internal signal remains. And this is not an accident. It is not a flaw. It is how the universe works. You do not experience reality directly. You experience only the differences that matter for interacting with it. And everything else, the vast, stable backgrounds, remains silent. So the question becomes, how much of what you take to be the whole picture is actually just a thin layer of detectable contrasts floating on top of something much larger and much more uniform? And the honest answer is, we don't know. We cannot know. Because the tools of knowing themselves rely on detecting differences. So the deepest structure of reality may include aspects that are permanently beyond all observation, all measurement, all intuition, not because they are mystical, but because they are perfectly consistent, perfectly uniform, perfectly shared, and therefore invisible from within. So you sit there, feeling the quiet certainty of being still in a stable world. But that certainty rests on a cancellation, a delicate balancing of shared motion and shared change that removes all signals of the deeper dynamics carrying you along. And physics does not remove that discomfort. It intensifies it. Because the more precisely we describe the universe, the more we discover that there is no final vantage point from which everything becomes fully visible and fully settled. There is always another frame, another transformation, another way in which what seemed absolute dissolves into relativity. So you are left in a peculiar position. You know that you are moving at extraordinary speeds. You know that time itself is not universal. You know that reality depends on perspective in ways that cannot be escaped. And yet, your experience continues to present a world that feels stable, unified, and anchored. That gap never closes. It cannot close. And that is where the real disturbance lies. Because it means that the world you live inside, the one that feels complete and self-contained, is not the world as it ultimately is. It is only the slice that can be revealed from within your frame. And there is no way to step outside that frame and see what remains beyond it. So the question does not resolve, it only expands. Because once you see that motion itself is relative, and time itself is relative, you begin to wonder, what else about reality, things you take as solid, final, unquestionable, might also be relational, conditional, incomplete. And that question does not lead to a neat conclusion. It leads to a widening horizon, one where the sense of a finished, fully graspable reality begins to slip away, not into chaos, not into mystery in a romantic sense, but into something quieter, more unsettling. A recognition that what you experience as a stable, settled world may be only a thin, local pattern carried along inside a universe whose full structure can never be fully brought into view from where you stand. Now let me take you somewhere even more uncomfortable, not by introducing something exotic, but by tightening the same idea until it begins to press against something you take for granted every second of your life. I want you to notice how strongly you feel that you are here, not just in space, but in a kind of solid, immediate sense. You feel located, centered, anchored in a particular position, with the world arranged around you. Objects are over there. Sounds come from somewhere. You sit inside a stable coordinate system that seems obvious and unquestionable. But this feeling, this sense of being fixed at a definite point, depends on something very fragile. It depends on the fact that your entire body, your senses, and your brain are all moving together in perfect synchrony. You don't notice this synchrony because it never breaks. But let's imagine, just for a moment, that it did. Suppose that, suddenly, without warning, every object in the room, the chair, the walls, the air, the ground beneath the building began drifting steadily to the left at a constant speed, not accelerating, just moving smoothly. uniformly. And suppose that your body moved with them perfectly. Every cell, every nerve, every molecule. You would not notice anything at all. There would be no sensation of motion, no visual change, no internal signal, because nothing would be changing relative to you. Now take that one step further. Suppose the entire planet did the same thing. Suppose the Earth suddenly began moving twice as fast around the sun, but everything on Earth, including you, sped up in exactly the same way. The oceans, the atmosphere, the ground beneath your feet, the clocks in your devices, the neurons firing in your brain, all of it adjusting in perfect lockstep. Would you detect it? Because detection requires a difference, a comparison, a mismatch between one process and another. And if all processes change together, there is nothing left to compare. Now here is the disturbing part. This is not just a hypothetical trick. It reflects a deep principle: you cannot observe uniform changes that affect everything equally, not because you lack the right instruments, but because observation itself depends on contrasts. So there may be entire classes of changes enormous, sweeping transformations that could occur in the universe without leaving any detectable trace from within. And that's a very unsettling idea, because it means that reality, as you experience it, is not just incomplete. It may be blind to entire dimensions of change that never create internal differences. You are embedded inside a moving, evolving system, but you only ever see the ripples, never the perfectly smooth currents carrying everything along. Now this begins to chip away at something deeper, because you probably feel almost instinctively that if something truly real were happening, there must be some way, at least in principle, to detect it, some ultimate experiment, some final measurement. But physics quietly suggests that this is not always true. Some aspects of reality are fundamentally undetectable from within certain frames, not because they are hidden, but because they produce no observable differences. And if you think about that carefully, it starts to dissolve something very basic about what you mean by real. Because you tend to equate reality with what can, in principle, be experienced or measured. But here we have a category of possible facts about the universe that could be completely real, physically meaningful, and yet permanently beyond all observation. They would exist without ever entering experience, without ever leaving a signal, without ever becoming part of what you call the world. And that leads to a strange tension, because your sense of reality feels tied to what is present to you, what you see, hear, feel, measure. But physics tells you that this presence is only a thin interface, a narrow window through which you perceive only relative differences. Everything perfectly shared, perfectly uniform, perfectly synchronized, all of that remains outside the window, and it always will. Now let's turn this towards something even more intimate, your sense of time passing. Right now, you feel time moving forward. There is a clear direction past behind you, future ahead. Moments seem to flow in a steady stream, but notice something subtle. You do not experience time itself. You experience change. You notice memory forming. You notice physical processes unfolding. You notice differences between one moment and the next. But if, somehow, everything in the universe, every physical process, every clock, every neural event slowed down by exactly the same factor, you would not detect it. Your thoughts would slow. Your heartbeat would slow. Your perception would slow. and the entire external world would slow with you. From within, everything would appear normal. Time would seem to flow just as it always has, because there would be no internal difference to reveal the change. So the speed of time is not something you can measure absolutely. It is only meaningful relative to other processes. And this leads to a very strange realization. The flow of time, you feel that steady sense of moving forward, is not a universal property of the universe. It is a local, relational phenomenon, emerging from how processes compare to one another within your frame. There is no external clock ticking outside all systems. There is no absolute tempo of the universe. There are only local rhythms, all defined relative to each other. And once again, you find yourself in the same pattern. What feels like a fundamental, unquestionable feature of reality turns out to be a relational effect, dependent on comparisons, not absolute states. So now we can see something unsettling. Your sense of being at rest, your sense of time flowing, your sense of being located in a stable world, all of these arise from a common structure. You detect differences within a shared frame. You do not detect the frame itself, and you cannot step outside it. So, the very foundation of your experience, the things that feel most solid and unquestionable, are actually the products of a cancellation. They arise because everything around you is changing together in ways that erase the deeper dynamics from view. Now, here's where it becomes psychologically disorienting, because you might begin to ask, if so much of reality is invisible simply because it is perfectly shared, if entire layers of motion, time, and change are hidden because they never produce internal contrasts, then how much of what you think of as the world is actually just a thin surface of detectable differences? And what lies beneath that surface? Physics cannot answer that question fully, not because it lacks sophistication, but because its methods themselves depend on detecting differences. Measurement requires contrast. Observation requires interaction. And where there is perfect uniformity, there is nothing to measure. So there may be aspects of reality that are not just unknown, but unknowable not in a mystical sense, but in a structural sense. They cannot be accessed from within any frame that shares them. And you, inevitably, share a frame with everything you can experience. So you are always inside the system you are trying to understand, never outside it, never able to see the whole. And this is not a temporary limitation. It is a permanent condition of being embedded in reality. Now, let me bring this back to that original question one more time. Why can't you feel the earth moving? Not because it moves smoothly, not because your senses are dull, but because you and everything around you participate in the same motion. You are carried along together, and in that perfect synchrony, all signals vanish. The motion cancels itself out from within. So what you call stillness is not the absence of motion. It is the absence of relative motion within your frame. And that is a very different thing, because it means that what feels like a stable foundation is actually a condition of perfect co-movement, a delicate balance in which enormous underlying dynamics remain hidden. So you live inside a world that feels settled and complete, but that sense of completeness arises precisely because so much is invisible to you. Because everything you share with the universe, everything perfectly synchronized, never announces itself. It remains silent. And that silence is not empty. It is filled with motion, change, and structure that you can never directly experience. So you sit there, feeling grounded, feeling that reality is solid and finished. But beneath that feeling lies a system of relationships, transformations, and hidden dynamics that never fully appear from within. And there is no final step, no ultimate experiment that will suddenly reveal the whole picture. Because the whole picture cannot be viewed from inside any single frame. And you never occupy more than one frame at a time. So the question does not resolve. It deepens. Because once you see how motion disappears when everything moves together, you begin to wonder how many other things in reality, things you assume are fixed. Absolute and complete might also dissolve when viewed from another frame. And that question has no endpoint. It only widens the horizon of uncertainty, leaving you in a strange position, knowing that enormous, continuous processes carry you through the universe, knowing that your experience hides them perfectly, and knowing that there is no way, even in principle, to step outside your embedded perspective and see reality in its entirety. So the feeling of being still, of being located in a stable world remains. But it no longer feels quite as solid, because you now see that it rests on a silence created by perfect synchrony with forces and motions you can never directly feel, and that silence never breaks. It only deepens the more you understand it. So now you find yourself in a very peculiar position, not confused. Exactly. You still know how to walk across a room, how to catch a falling object, how to predict where a moving car will be in the next second. All the ordinary rules that guide your daily life still work perfectly well. And yet, underneath that practical certainty, something has begun to loosen, because you can now see that what feels like a stable, finished reality is not stable in the way you instinctively imagined. It is stable only within a particular frame, a frame you cannot leave. And this is where the discomfort becomes very quiet and very deep. Because you realize that it's not just motion that disappears when everything moves together. It's not just time that becomes unmeasurable when all processes change at the same rate. It's not just location that dissolves into relativity when there is no absolute reference point. It's something more fundamental than all of those. It's the idea that reality could ever be completely given to you, fully present, fully revealed, fully graspable in a single, final way. That idea begins to slip away. Let me try to bring you into that feeling slowly. Right now, you have a strong sense that the world is there. Solid, complete, finished in some sense, whether or not you understand all of its details. You might not know everything about the universe, but you probably feel that it exists as a definite, fully formed structure, something that is entirely determined, even if your knowledge of it is partial. But what we've been circling around suggests something very different. It suggests that what you call the world is not a single, fully determined picture waiting to be uncovered. It is always defined relative to how you interact with it, relative to how you move through it, relative to how you measure it, relative to how you slice it into space and time. And there is no way to assemble all possible slices into one final, absolute view, because each slice depends on a frame, and no frame contains them all. So reality, as you can ever encounter it, is not a finished map. It is more like an endless set of overlapping maps, each valid within its own perspective. None of them complete on their own. None of them capable of being merged into a single, ultimate picture. And here is where the unease settles in. Because you begin to realize that this is not just a limitation of your knowledge. It is not something that will disappear if you become smarter, or build better instruments, or develop more advanced theories. It is built into the structure of observation itself. You cannot observe without being somewhere. You cannot measure without interacting. You cannot describe reality without choosing a frame, and every one of those choices excludes other possibilities. So the dream of a perfectly objective view, a view from nowhere, a final perspective outside all frames is not merely difficult. It is impossible. And that realization quietly erodes something very deep in how you think about understanding. Because understanding, in your intuition, feels like moving closer to a final answer, closer to a state where the world is fully pinned down, fully explained, fully settled. But the deeper you go, the more you find that there is no such resting point. Each layer of explanation reveals new relationships, new frames, new dependencies. Not a final foundation, just more structure, more relativity, more conditions under which statements are true. And this leads to a very strange feeling. It is not ignorance, because you know more than you did before. It is not confusion, because the logic is clear. It is something else, a kind of quiet instability, because you can see that what you took to be the firm ground of reality, the sense that things ultimately just are in a fixed, absolute way, is not something you can actually justify. Not from within any frame, not from any observation, not from any measurement. You can only justify statements relative to other statements, measurements relative to other measurements, frames relative to other frames. There is always another layer of comparison, never a final, independent anchor. Now bring this back, one last time, to that simple experience of sitting still. You feel at rest. But that feeling arises from a perfect cancellation, a synchrony between your motion and the motion of everything around you. You are carried along so completely that all signals of movement vanish. And this same pattern repeats at deeper levels. Your sense of time flowing steadily arises because your internal processes and external processes remain synchronized. Your sense of being located arises because your sensory systems and environment share a stable relationship. Your sense of reality being complete arises because all your observations are embedded within a single frame that never reveals what lies beyond it. So in every case, what feels like a final, stable condition is actually the product of a shared background, a perfectly balanced system that hides its deeper dynamics. And there is no way to break out of that balance from within. Because any attempt to observe the background itself requires a difference from it. And if you differ from it, you are no longer fully sharing it. So you never encounter the deepest structures of reality directly. You encounter only the differences that emerge when something deviates from the shared background. The ripples, never the perfectly smooth currents. And this leads to a final, unsettling shift. Because you begin to see that reality, as you live it, is not something you stand outside and look at. It is something you are immersed inside, something that carries you along, shapes your perception, and sets the conditions under which anything can appear at all. You cannot step outside it to see it whole. You cannot detach from all frames at once. You cannot feel the total motion of the system you are embedded in. So, the universe, in its entirety, is never something you can experience as a single, unified object. It is always encountered from within, from a particular position, at a particular time, in a particular state of motion. And from that position, there will always be aspects that remain silent, not hidden behind complexity, not concealed by distance, but silent because they are perfectly shared with you, because you are part of them. So when you sit quietly and feel that you are still, when you feel that the world is stable and complete, What you are actually feeling is a kind of cancellation, a quiet equilibrium inside a vast network of motions, transformations, and relationships that never fully appear from within. And that equilibrium can never reveal the whole, because it depends on being inside the system, not outside it. So the question we began with, why you cannot feel the earth moving, never really resolves into a neat explanation. It opens outward instead, into a recognition that the absence of feeling is not a gap in your senses. It is a sign of something deeper, that you are always embedded in the very reality you are trying to understand, carried along by it, synchronized with it, unable to step outside it. And because of that, there will always be aspects of what is happening enormous, continuous, foundational aspects that remain beyond your experience, beyond your measurement, beyond any final description. Not because they are mysterious in a poetic sense, but because they produce no differences relative to where you stand. And without differences, there is no signal. Without a signal, there is no observation. And without observation, there is no way to bring those aspects into the world you call real. So you remain here inside a moving system that feels still, inside a flowing time that feels steady, inside a relational universe that feels complete, knowing that beneath that feeling lies something that cannot be fully brought into view, something that cannot be felt, even in principle. And that fact does not resolve into a comforting answer. It simply remains a quiet, persistent widening of the question. Not what reality ultimately is, but how much of it can ever appear from within a frame that can never step outside itself. And that question does not close. It only continues, silently, as everything, including you, keeps moving together through a universe whose full motion can never be fully felt